African American history, and particularly the relationship between race, masculinity, civil rights, and religion in the 20th century Black freedom movements. He has a book that's going to be coming out sometime, that examines the Nation of Islam's racial and masculine ideologies and understands how and why some Black American groups opposed integration during the mid-20th century. And the project traced the Nation of Islam's founding from its origins in the Great Depression in Detroit all the way to its schism with Elijah Muhammad, following the death of Elijah Muhammad, and its restoration in 1975. Today, Dr. Stuart will be giving us a presentation called Dr. King, Brother Malcolm, and Mrs. Hammer, Identity and Action in the Black Freedom Movement. Let's welcome Dr. Joseph Stuart.
Thanks for having me today. It's a joy to be here with you. My family is from Sanpete County, and so I was very excited to drive through Moroni and see the sign for Woodruff as well. I'd like to thank Snow College for having me out today, and thank each of you for coming out. I know you have to be here, but at least you're pretending to be awake and or paying attention for now. Not here to judge, just here to love. Something that has happened over the course of your lifetimes, but also over the course of many Americans' lifetimes, is seeing how race and gender affect politics and political movements. And in the past decade, we've seen events like the murder of George Floyd, lack of regard for Breonna Taylor's death, continued disappearance of Indigenous women, mass violence against Asian American communities, and rhetoric around Latino and Latina communities that helps us to think about who is considered an inside group and who is considered to be an outside group. And because I study the African American civil rights movement or Black freedom movements in the 20th century, I want to talk about three thinkers in the Black freedom movement. And I often pause to think, how would someone like Martin Luther King lead today? Would he have a podcast? Would he read the ads for the podcast? How would Malcolm X use TikTok to convey his message? And how would Fannie Lou Hamer use her moral courage and ability to speak to people who often aren't met, their needs aren't met by politicians, to make the world a better place? And so with that wondering, I'll tell you a little bit about what we're going to talk about today. First is thinking about how class and gender and religion shaped political action, to which I can hear you all thinking, wow, he must have lots of friends. People love to talk to him at parties if he likes to talk about this stuff. But I promise that I've taken care to think about how Dr. King, how Brother Malcolm, and Mrs. Hamer all approached civil rights in very different ways, but all with the overarching goal of granting more rights, more human rights, more freedom rights, more civil rights to Black people in America. I'll also say that while these three are pretty well-known examples, most revolutionary work in matters of politics and freedom movements is done not through loud headlines, but by people showing up for people and communities that they share or that they care about. And so as you're sitting here today, you might think to yourself, how am I working to make the world a better place? How am I showing my communities that I care about them? So the first person we're going to talk about here is Martin Luther King Jr., who is probably the best well-known of the three here. How many of you, just raise of hands, did any of you learn about Dr. King in elementary school, high school, middle school? Did any of you learn any songs about Dr. King? I won't share any with you now, but I learned like 4 in kindergarten that still stay with me today. He came from a long line of Black Protestant clergy who worked for the pursuit of civil rights for African Americans. His grandfather, named Michael, and his father, named Michael, were both Baptists in Atlanta, and his mother, Alberta Williams King, was, if it's possible, I don't know, I grew up in a pretty religious family. She was even stricter than the men in her family about keeping rules related to religion. And Martin Luther King, as he grew up, expressed some doubt in the religion that he grew up in and really didn't know if religion and churches were the places that he wanted to be. However, he remembered an inner urge that he wanted to serve humanity. And as he went through school, he recognized that he wanted to, like his father and grandfather, become a preacher in order not only to teach the message of the gospel of Jesus Christ, but to work as a political leader in his community. King received ordination during the final year of his undergraduate career at Morehouse College, a prestigious historically black institution in downtown Atlanta. And King's ordination, it seems, gave him confidence because shortly after his graduation, he wrote a letter to the editor of a white-run newspaper called the Atlanta Constitution that's still published today in 1946. This was following the police killing of Maceo Snipes, who had decided to vote, which was either illegal or extremely discouraged in Taylor County, Georgia, and had died at the hands of white folks and then police who declined to pursue the case. The event was followed by as many as 20 other white folks shooting at African Americans who tried to register to vote or who were driving on the road in Taylor County. And so in this letter, King calls out white supremacists and called attention to the fact that many people of, quote, a certain class hurry to raise the scarecrow of social mingling and intermarriage whenever black folks agitated for better treatment under the law. He lamented that most people who kick up this kind of dust know that it is simple dust to obscure the real question of rights and opportunities. These opportunities to King included equal opportunities in education, health, recreation, and public services, the right to vote, equality before the law, some of the same courtesy and good manners that we ourselves bring to all human relations. And so I can see in your eyes what I think I recognized for the first time as I read this letter, in thinking about how even before he was the Martin Luther King Jr., he was thinking about the position of black folks in American society and what could be done to bring out better treatment for all. It's also important to recognize that King's actions and philosophies had roots in a religious commitment to, as he called it, the religion of the master. And King enrolled at Crozier Theological Seminary and eventually earned a doctorate in systematic theology at Boston University. And while he was there, he met, dated, and married Coretta Scott, who is here kissing his cheek here. I love this photo of them, by the way, because most photos of Martin Luther King are like very serious, right? I don't know, this is two young people in love. I think it's just a really nice way to think about folks outside of the usual context that we see them. He ultimately graduated with his doctorate and accepted a position at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. Now, Dexter Avenue had just declined to renew the contract of their current minister because he was too involved in civil rights. They saw him as being too involved in political work and wanted him to stay more in the pulpit and less in the streets protesting justice, which I wonder how that minister felt when Martin Luther King became a leader of the Black Freedom Movement in Montgomery, Alabama. Now, after Rosa Parks, who you may also know, declined to leave a bus to give up her seat for a white patron on the bus, there was a mass protest that broke out. Now, I don't know if you all remember, I'll try not to mention 2020 just in general because of COVID and a lot of things that went on, but there were a lot of protests that led to social action, that led to new legislation and new ways of imagining ourselves as a community together. And so after Mrs. Parks refused to give up her seat, Reverend King stood up at a Baptist church called Holt Street Baptist Church, where the Montgomery bus boycott was being finalized as a formal movement. He preached to approximately 5,000 black folks that day in a very tiny church. You can actually hear the audio. If you go to the Martin Luther King Jr. papers at Stanford University, they have the audio for this address if you want to hear the full thing. But one of the lines that really stuck out to me is when he says, "This is the glory of America with all its faults, that citizens could call upon their government for justice, and if we are wrong," he thundered, "the Constitution of the United States is wrong. If we are wrong, God Almighty is wrong. If we are wrong, Jesus of Nazareth was merely a utopian dreamer that never came down to earth." Now you can imagine how this would really rile up a Christian community who was deeply invested in the idea that not only that Jesus Christ had died for their sins, but that he came to Earth to show a better way that we might interact one with another. And this speech reveals King's logic in years to come. Black Americans had a right to protest, and that, as he would later say in his I Have a Dream speech, the United States had written a check for universal equality and freedom, and that those who pursued freedom had come to claim that check. King had absolute confidence in the United States' ability to live up to its ideals, and that America could form what he called a beloved community, where peoples of all races, faiths, and ideologies could live peacefully together. He was also deeply influenced by Mahatma Gandhi and his anti-colonial nonviolent movement that he led on the Indian subcontinent to free the people of Southeast Asia, India, from British control. This means that not only was he looking at the United States and looking at the Christian gospel for inspiration, but that he was pursuing cosmopolitan and non-Christian ways of trying to gain more freedom. King's publicizing these movements in Africa, Oceania, and Asia, and working with those who are working in decolonizing movements, so removing European or American governments who control the country to go back to local control, eventually led, at least in part, to the successes that Black freedom movement enjoyed. Now, this also meant that there are some really interesting political cartoons that came out of this. Because in the Cold War, the Soviet Union would use the United States' treatment of Black people and other marginalized people as an example of why under socialism, life was better. So if you all can see this here, there's a Black man who is chained here. He's up there in the front, and he is under a would-be Statue of Liberty here. So, this is just like the creepiest would-be Statue of Liberty of all time. He has too many teeth, I think. But I think this is how Soviets would say the American government is telling a lie. They are not actually offering freedom to all people, but just to some people, and definitely not to Black folks. So the Soviet Union would use this as a way of showing its moral superiority and arguing that that nations who are decolonizing, leaving from European and American governments, could become socialist and join with the Soviet Union rather than the United States. So part of what I think is really interesting in this way, though, is that King, although he was initially horrified at this sort of imagery because he loved the United States and America so much, came to recognize that if the USSR would put moral pressure on the United States, that change would be possible. And that turned out to be true. King went on to win the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964 and was a key part of the passing of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. However, the King that we know today was not nearly as popular in the last few years of his life. Shortly before his assassination in 1968, more than 65% of Americans disliked King and saw him as a negative influence on the nation. The day before his murder, King had preached that while he may not see the day when Black Americans lived in an interracial beloved community with white folks, he knew that African Americans as a people would get to the promised land. And King's work, of course, continues today, and his words continue to inspire. The next person I want to talk about is Brother Malcolm X. Have any of you seen the Spike Lee film Malcolm X or read the autobiography of Malcolm X? Tupac talks about Malcolm X. I told my students I quoted Tupac, and they had no idea who I was talking about, which made me feel 1,000 years old yesterday. Okay, so this is Malcolm X. He was born as Malcolm Little. In 1925, his mother was from the Caribbean, and his father was a working-class Baptist preacher from the American Midwest. And the Little family moved frequently because his father was an itinerant preacher, so he moved around where he could preach. He was also involved with Marcus Garvey's movement for an international or Pan-African movement for Black equality, meaning all people of African descent moving together for equality throughout the globe. So like King's father, Malcolm's father advocated for his community, but from a far less respectable or stable position than MLK's father did with a well-established pastorate in Atlanta. Malcolm's family was threatened on several occasions by white supremacist groups, including the Ku Klux Klan, and Malcolm remembered his parents holding shotguns as white men in masks came to their door in Lansing, Michigan, where they had settled by the time Malcolm was 5. In 1931, Earl, his father, was run over by a train and did not receive the medical attention he needed to survive. Malcolm soon after had his first experience learning that White folks could not be trusted if black lives were at stake, especially because when the life insurance company that should have paid out money from his father's death, they refused to do so, claiming that his father had died by suicide. Soon after not receiving this life insurance payout, Malcolm's mother slipped into mental instability, and she struggled to keep her 7 children fed. Eventually, she was placed into a mental institution, and all of the kids went to live with additional family members. Louise spent most of the rest of her life in a mental health institution. Young Malcolm was sent to Boston to live with his father's sister, Ella Little, and he spent the next several years between Boston and New York City's Harlem, where he worked as a small-time drug dealer and committing burglaries to get ahead financially. I'm not advocating for this, for the record. Those he worked with included a man he nicknamed Shorty and 2 white women. The 4 of them would work together to burgle houses. The prosecutors ultimately threw the book when they were caught at the 2 black men and allowed the 2 white women to go off nearly scot-free. So again, Malcolm recognizes in his life that black people are not given the same sorts of treatment that white people are. And as you can imagine, this had a really negative impact on Malcolm's life, especially as he was going to prison. He later would describe himself as so angry at the world that he would yell at everybody, disrespect anybody, that his fellow prisoners would call him Satan, because all he did was hate other people. But his life would change in the late 1940s, after he had been in prison for more than a year, when his brother Wilfred wrote him a letter telling him that he had joined a religion called the Nation of Islam, which taught that white people were evil and that black people were by nature godly, that the Nation of Islam was the true religion for black men in America, and that the white man's religion was Christianity. So setting up these 2 poles, the idea that black religion was Islamic and white religion is Christianity, and the 2 could never come together. Now, you may be thinking that does not sound like somebody trying to build a beloved community or somebody who's trying to bring people together in the sort of famous quotes in the way that Dr. King did in his I Have a Dream speech. And you would be accurate in that. And in fact, part of what's interesting about this is that Malcolm abandoned the thought that white people would ever work with black people, ever have any incentive to be able to do so. The Nation of Islam was by definition a black supremacist faith. They viewed black people as superior to white people, and they believed that white people would always seek to weaken black initiatives and black political movements. Once he was visiting a classroom in Atlanta, and Malcolm X said, "What's the fastest way to weaken black coffee? Integrate it with white cream." So here's another political cartoon where we can think about the sorts of ways that the Nation of Islam is telling a story about race in America. So this came from the Nation of Islam's newspaper called Muhammad Speaks. And what they're saying is that black men are willing to integrate. Sure, I love everybody. I'm willing to give up on my racial identity, the gifts given by God to me, in pursuit of a white woman here who is labeled integration and is wearing a cross here. So here we have the truth of self and her would save you. Christianity tempts her slave. So you can see there's nothing particularly subtle as we're thinking about the way that the Nation of Islam frames itself as black against white and Islam against Christianity. Now, Malcolm X ultimately left the Nation of Islam before he was assassinated in 1965, and he converted to Sunni Islam. And he later accepted help from whites and pursued help from whites to be able to pursue black freedom in a multiracial coalition. But heartbreakingly, he was assassinated by members of the Nation of Islam in front of his wife and his daughters in February of 1965. Third person I'm going to tell you about today is named Fannie Lou Hamer. Have any of you heard of Fannie Lou Hamer? Okay, 1. Hey, love this. Love when anyone has heard of her. So Mrs. Hamer was born to a family of sharecroppers, and sharecropping works a lot. I'm trying to oversimplify, and I'm just going to have to tell you the full thing. Somebody owns the land that people farm on, and they lend you the money to be able to put seeds in the ground and to be able to have food on the table and clothes on your back, and then when harvest time comes, you pay them back. But under sharecropping, there are or very few legal protections for workers, and often what they would find out is that they were in debt slavery to those whose land they worked on. So small children would have to contribute, folks were not going to school, families would do anything they could to try to get ahead so that they could buy land for themselves, and that never happened for the Hamer family. By age 6, she picked cotton with her family after school, but by 12, she left school for good and never participated in formal education again. Sharecropping, also known as slavery by another name, as some historians have called it, had trapped her and her family in this cycle of not being able to rise above the position in which they were born. However, when Fannie Lou married Perry Hamer in 1944, she was much happier but still continued to work as a sharecropper. In 1961, 17 years after her marriage to Pap, as she lovingly called him, her life changed. She attended a joint meeting of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, two black freedom organizations organized by Christians and those who tried to work under Christian principles for racial equality. And she decided that she would follow their advice and work to vote in her home county of Sunflower, Mississippi. On August 31st, 1962, she and 17 other freedom fighters drove to a nearby courthouse to vote, and they were denied based on a literacy test, so they came up with complicated questions that you had to find answers to and answer perfectly that were not offered to white people on the same sort of scale. After they were denied, they started driving home dejectedly, and soon a police car stopped them and gave the group a ticket for $100 for driving a bus that was too yellow, which is not a thing for those keeping score at home. When Mrs. Hamer returned home after a stint in jail, her landlord employer, the person who owned the land that she sharecropped on, fired her and informed her that her husband was not fired, but would still be expected to produce as much cotton as he would with her on the land at harvest time. If her landlord thought that this would end Mrs. Hamer's activism, though, he was sorely mistaken. She and other black women integrated a restaurant in Winona, Mississippi, and were arrested for their efforts. At the jailhouse, policemen sexually assaulted her and beat her so severely that she suffered lifelong disabilities from it. We'll look at more pictures of her. You can see that one of her eyes droops, and she had problems with her vision for the rest of her life. Bent but unbowed, Mrs. Hamer redoubled her efforts after securing her release and founded a new political party called the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. Now, this is something that's not very familiar to us. In the presidential election last week, almost all of the states in the South, those that especially define themselves as Southern, voted very solidly Republican. But until 1980, the U.S. South was seen as solidly Democratic. The Democratic Party ran the U.S. South. And so because the Democratic Party would not allow African Americans full voice, she formed the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party to be able to give black people a voice. She went to the national organization for the Democratic National Convention. Politics were very different then. Somebody was selected to run for president in the summer, and they would run from there instead of people running for 1 or 2 or 4 years the entire time before the election. And her testimony was so powerful that President Lyndon B. Johnson, the President of the United States, called a fake press conference in order to distract. Remember, there are 4 channels here, right? This isn't being live streamed on YouTube or on Facebook or on Instagram or anything like that. Everyone had to turn because the president was speaking. And her testimony was so impactful that he felt threatened and called this press conference. However, that backfired on President Johnson because the fake press conference said nothing interesting. They said, why is he trying to distract from what Mrs. Hamer is saying? And so in today's terms, she went viral. Her testimony appeared in hundreds of newspapers, and people heard her testimony about how she tried to register to vote and heard about how she and her comrades had been arrested for driving in a bus that was too young. Now, part of what I always find really interesting with Mrs. Hamer is thinking about the working class roots that she came from. So she came from being a sharecropper. She was born into a family. She was the 19th of 20 kids, which, yeah, there's sort of a like, whoa, kind of going through here, right? If you're poor and you have 20 kids, you have 20 kids who can work, but that also means you have 20 mouths to feed, right? So in these photographs of Mrs. Hamer, we don't have nearly as many of her as we do of Reverend King, Dr. King, or of Brother Malcolm or Minister Malcolm. But what I love about this photo is that this is not staged at all. Right, so like we live in a world with Instagram or Snapchat or TikTok where like we're taking 100 takes, we're doing a burst, we're taking the 0.5 out so that we can get the perfect selfie, right? This is her at her best, and she is singing Christian hymns to organize people to fight for freedom in Mississippi, where people had died and would continue to die through the 1960s as black folks organized for the right to vote. I think it's important to think about how all three of these freedom fighters, Dr. King, Brother Malcolm, and Mrs. Hamer, used religion to inspire others around them to pursue black freedom. So this is from Dr. King. I have to live with the meaning of my commitment to the ministry of Jesus Christ. To me, the relationship of this ministry to the making of peace is so obvious that I sometimes marvel at those who ask me why I'm speaking against the war in Vietnam. Could it be that they do not know that the good news was meant for all men, for communist and capitalist, for their children and ours, for black and for white, for revolutionary and for conservatives? Have they forgotten that my ministry is in obedience to the one who loved his enemies so fully that he died for them? Pretty stirring statement, and I think that many of you who will be familiar with Christianity will see he's directly tying this to Jesus Christ's title of the Prince of Peace as found in the New Testament. Now, of course, Brother Malcolm sees things very differently than the Christian King, and very different than other Muslims, I want to be careful to say as well. The Nation of Islam is a pretty small Islamic group and is not part of, they don't run the government of a nation in the way that Sunni or Shia Muslims do. So here's something that I really appreciate about what Brother Malcolm said, connecting his religion to his freedom. There's nothing in our book, the Quran, that teaches us to suffer peacefully. Our religion teaches us to be intelligent, be peaceful, be courteous, obey the law, respect everyone, but if somebody puts his hand on you, send him to the cemetery. That's a good religion. In fact, that's the old-time religion. That's a good religion, and doesn't nobody resent that kind of religion being taught but a wolf who intends to make you his meal. Okay, so we can see some very different ways of approaching a religious message saying that, no, God does not want us to be downtrodden, but rather he wants us to fight back for ourselves. Don't seek out an argument, but also don't turn one down if someone continues to pursue you. So Mrs. Hamer said this: Christianity is being concerned about others, not building $1 million church while people are starving right around the corner. Christ was a revolutionary person out there where it was happening. So you can also see how her vision of Jesus matches what she was doing, right? She was out with the people. She was organizing intentionally. She was trying to pursue people in a peaceful way, but also not apologizing or disrupting the status quo. And so again, just want you to look at this photo of her singing. By all accounts, she sang all of the time, which I'm sure she sounded better than me, but I can also see how having that associated with you, especially singing gospel hymns, would have a way of inspiring people in a way that words alone could not. It's also important for us to think about the way that class plays in, the way that how much money you have or what sort of position you're in, excuse me, plays into the type of way that you are portrayed or understood as you're sharing a message. So Martin Luther King in the middle, have any of you ever seen a photo of him where he's not wearing a suit and tie? He loved to wear cufflinks, he wore great ties, like he's very stylish, right? He's a very professional person, very put together, and that is very much on purpose. This is the idea that black folks are here to claim the rights and privileges that are promised to them in the Constitution and in other promises and ideals stated in America's founding documents. And so the thought was, if we wear our Sunday best, if we show them just how good we are, they'll have no choice but to accept us into their society. Now, what's interesting is that Malcolm X also always wore a suit and tie, but he did this for the complete opposite reason. He said, we don't need to impress any white folks. We are doing this because we want to stand up for ourselves and show to ourselves that we are worth fighting for. We don't care if folks think that we're wearing our Sunday best. We're wearing our best because we want to show Allah that we trust in him and that he will bring about black freedom. Now, Mrs. Hamer, who grew up very poor, continued to be poor her entire life, her very neat dresses are ironed perfectly, they're starched, but as you look at photos of her, she is wearing the same dresses, often for years at a time. Now, let me be clear, there's nothing wrong with this, but she did not have the sort of resources that Dr. King or Brother Malcolm did. And it's also important to keep in mind, too, that the Democratic Party would not listen to her in ways that they would listen to Dr. King or Brother Malcolm, at least in part because of her economic background and position. You can also think about gender in this regards, too. So Martin Luther King, if you grew up in the United States and went to public school, you can probably hear the "I have a dream" sort of cadence, right? He has a classic, there are people who study this, thinking about sort of the cadence of the classic Baptist minister, thinking about rising to a crescendo and really inspiring you with those big, fiery words. We also have Malcolm X, who went out of his way to say things like, yeah, we'll leave you alone, but if you don't, we'll send you to the hospital, right? Tough guy. Very in your face, very militant about what is being pursued. So you have two different versions of thinking about like how to be a religious man in these contexts. So you have the sort of like, I belong in a boardroom, you're used to seeing me in a pulpit, I wear nice clothes, I'm very respectable. But then you also have someone who is very in your face, very militant, and telling you how they feel. What's interesting in thinking about Mrs. Hamer in this regard is thinking about how she always has to give deference to those in power in ways that are different than Malcolm and Martin because she is a woman. People do not take her as seriously. This brings me no joy to say, everyone should be treated equally, right? But she is not treated in nearly the same way as she is purely because she was a woman. It's also important to keep in mind too, I just want to mention this really quickly in thinking about bodies. Most of you sort of nodded or started thinking if you had ever seen Martin Luther King, if you had ever seen him not in a shirt and tie, a suit and tie. Same thing for Malcolm X. There are more photos of Mrs. Hamer with her arms showing, so either sleeveless dresses or two here, than there are anywhere else. Which bodies are covered up? Which bodies are asked or are exposed? Again, so here's Malcolm X. Every single photo except for like 3 that I've seen him in, he just looks mad at the world. And this is like a very masculine posture, right? Trying to show I'm a tough guy, you need to listen to me. I'll also say he is like maybe the most charismatic speaker of the 20th century. So if you all are looking for sort of a taste of what he's looking for, there's probably my favorite speech of his that he gave is called A Message to the Grassroots. But he also spoke after several police brutality rallies or to protest against it, where he shared his thoughts, and he's a very sharp thinker, has a very sharp tongue. MLK, again, we can see the sort of performance of gender here. And I know that that sort of phrasing can turn people off, but thinking about how he is trying to portray himself, right? He is trying to show that, like, no, I'm a minister, I'm a man of God, I'm a man of the cloth, I'm wearing a suit to jail, I'm sitting here very peacefully in jail, looking out, waiting to be free, comparing myself to the Apostle Paul from the New Testament, right? And then we also have Mrs. Hamer, who again, I've never seen a photo of Malcolm or Martin with their arms exposed. And again, they didn't live in Mississippi, let's be clear too, right? We can dress for the weather that we live in, but because she is not nearly as put together, she doesn't have the budget that the other 2 men do, she's constantly, she is not in the same way as like, I want to say this carefully, she is not posed for photographs in the same way. She doesn't have a sort of brand as a way of being recognized in this way, right? It's really important to to recognize that the way that we dress often shows how we are approaching our audience or how we want people to see us. And so I love this photo. Again, this is not a posed photo, but here she is, so not with the black power fist, but with a black fist raised nonetheless, thinking about we are going to fight for our freedom, while wearing a dress that she could also very comfortably wear at a potluck at her local church. So where do we go from here? This is something that we've seen, especially in the last 5 years, in thinking about the role of religion in pursuing black freedom. So for instance, in 2020, I was part of a Black Lives Matter march in South Jordan, Utah. And as I walked past Latter-day Saint temple there, I thought about how absolutely wild it was that there were hundreds of people, many of whom were probably Latter-day Saints, in a Black Lives Matter rally with kids on their backs and in strollers, singing Latter-day Saint primary hymns, marching for black equality. In the same way, religious people find inspiration in pursuing freedom for many people. Here we have Muslims for Black Lives in the wake of the George Floyd murder. Also have Black Lives Matter, Jesus thinks so too. So these are the sorts of things that we can think about is how does a religion, how does gender, how does class, how do these sort of big categories of identity shape the way that folks work to create a better world for us to live in? Now, you all have been very patient with me, and I really appreciate it. If you're looking to learn more, if any of you use Libby or use Audible, I would love for you to read a physical book, but we're all very busy people, right? David Garrow's Bearing the Cross, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Les and Tamara Payne's The Dead Are Arising, The Life of Malcolm X, and Keisha Blaine's Until I Am Free, Fannie Lou Hamer's Enduring Message to America, are all available as audiobooks. And because I was a student once too, I will tell you that Keisha Blaine's is the shortest. But these are the sorts of things that as students at college you have the opportunity to learn about. I appreciate you having me here today because I too was a college student who wanted to learn about the world around me and found opportunities in lectures and in classes that forced me to think about different ways than I had been taught growing up, expanding but not in no way disrespectful to my views. That helped me to see how I can make the world a better place. Thanks, y'all.
Okay, so we have about 10 minutes for questions. Again, when we ask questions, just make sure you have the microphone before you ask. That way, for those watching the live stream, they can also hear the questions. Maybe while you're thinking about questions to talk about, maybe I'll just ask a very a short one. You used the term, before you guys can, you used the term Black Freedom Movement and civil rights. Are those exchangeable or are there differences in those terms?
Yeah, so I think that this is a really important question. They are exchangeable. You can use them vice versa, right? But why I prefer Black Freedom Movement rather than Civil Rights Movement is that Black Freedom Movement connects movements in the United States to movements throughout the world. So this is something that actually Brother Malcolm was very involved in. One of the things he wanted to do before he was assassinated was to bring the United States before the United Nations on human rights charges, saying that you are denying us our human rights and thus you should be censured by the United Nations. So you're never going to be wrong by saying Civil Rights Movement, but I prefer Black Freedom, and this is actually one of those things that some academics like to argue about which that one term is better than the other. I think that just distracts us from the hard work of making the world a better place. Should we argue about labels, or should we worry about the people? Trying to make the world a better place. Thanks for asking that.
I can't remember if you stated anything about this, but you said that Mrs. Hamer had children. Were any of her children involved with what she did?
Yeah, she did. And so as I'm standing up here, I'm not recalling exactly how many children, but that was part of the bravery that it took to register to vote and ultimately losing her job, was that she had kids to worry about. all three of them had kids who they worried about constantly, especially because Dr. King and Mrs. Hamer were in and out of prison pretty frequently, and Malcolm X had an international travel schedule. They often wrote home or called home, and we know this because the FBI tapped their phones. We know that they missed their kids pretty terribly. And so that's just something, again, to think about, is that pursuing making the world a better place it almost always comes with costs. So thanks for asking.
Were there any records of their kids full on supporting them or helping them with
Yeah,
what they
so,
were doing?
oh, sorry, did I cut you off?
No, I was just
Okay, so this is something that King's kids continue to be very active in civil rights movements. So Bernice King is maybe the best well known, but also Martin Luther King III have national profiles. Bernice King was very involved in organizing the Super Bowl that was in Atlanta in the last few years, and they worked together there. So Malcolm's daughters, several are academics or otherwise involved in teaching others about their father's mission and pursuing black civil rights. One daughter named Ilyasa runs a center, the Shabazz Center, in the memory of her and her mother, who was also a black freedom fighter. And then for Mrs. Hamer, her children continue to be very involved, but like Mrs. Hamer, is almost always at a local level too. And so there's actually a really lovely book that you all can check out too. That's called, I believe it's called Mama Fanny or Mama Hamer, that her daughter wrote about what it was like growing up, having a prominent civil rights leader as her mom growing up.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It was awesome. I have a question about kind of arguments, religious arguments that go against what these leaders have said. So when I think of both Christianity and Islam, I feel like they're unique among religions, or maybe not that unique, but when I think of both of them have spread throughout the world and have encompassed people of all different races and ethnicities and nationalities. So they're similar in that way. And it's very clear to me how you can use both of those religions and what's written in their scriptures to promote like equality between religions. And I'm just curious, what are some of the most common religion-based arguments that people then or even now have given for supporting racist views and actions? Like, do you know of specific things in the Quran or the Bible that are most commonly used to say, no, Jesus didn't want us all to love each other, or something along those lines?
Yeah, so thank you for the question. It's a really thoughtful one. The first thing that I'll say is that religion in and of itself, folks can use it to whatever end they choose. They can do it to promote equality, they can do it to promote inequality. It's about the individual and how they're choosing to interpret a certain religious tradition or ways of thinking religiously. So something really prominent in Christianity, there are certain ideas around God created separate races, and those that survived after Noah's flood in the book of Genesis in the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. And there are also ideas around servitude that came up around those racial ideas. There's a great book called The Myth of Ham by Sylvester Johnson, if folks are interested in more of this, that created a racial distinction between black folks and white folks, or Europeans and Africans, to be more precise. Which again, folks can see as sort of silly because there are white people in Africa and there are people who are black in Europe as well, right? Race is not something that is fixed or determined. Its meaning pretty constantly changes. Now, so far as Islam goes in the Quran, the argument that I'm most familiar with, and again, I don't find any of these particularly compelling on an ethical or arguing about history sort of level, but thinking about believers versus non-believers, Islam is very cosmopolitan, it's very multiracial from the beginning, as is Christianity, and it's only as time moves on that folks start to create what I would label false distinctions about who deserves more rights or better treatment or less rights and worse treatment. Sometimes this feels a little bit trite or like oversimplifying to say, but religious folks and non-religious folks, it's really what are they choosing to do with their beliefs and their actions, far more than what it says specifically in a set of scriptures or that religious leaders might say. In my experience, is what does the individual person do in their life that shows me how seriously somebody takes their religion, at least as they are pursuing the world for pursuing good.
Well, it is right about 1:20, so if we could give a round of applause. Well, actually, stop. Not yet. Okay. If you have questions that maybe you didn't feel comfortable asking in an entire group or have to talk to me or anything else, we'll be hanging out for a few minutes here. But let's give a round of applause for Dr. Stuart, who came and talked to us.